So this is the Room to Write with the Journey of a Story series,
Right.
just to put that out there.
Right.
And this is a sort of writer's roundup, I think we might have called it, or a rewrite, because we're seeing what you're up to since the last time we talked to you.
Okay.
When you published a wonderful article on the WGBH blog,
Right.
and now you have a book called Bouncing Back, How Women Lose and Find Themselves in Marriage and Divorce.
Right.
So take it away, Ellen. Let us know a little bit
Okay.
about
Well,
how
I'll fill
how
you in on the
came
past
here.
7 years.
Okay.
I think I probably did maybe a couple more essays. I was into writing personal essays at the time. GBH, other places about my experience. And then I had an idea. I was taking a lot of classes at Grub Street, which is a writing community in Boston. And in the spring of 2019, I just had this idea for how I could write a book. And I'm a psychotherapist, as you know. And I thought, well, what if I write a book about my experiences and combine it with experiences of a couple of my patients? But it just sort of came to me, and I did a little writing about it. And then I saw a book called, well, I don't have to talk about the title of it, but she had done just what I was thinking of doing. And she's very successful. I mean, enormously successful before she wrote this book, since she's written this book. But it just showed me that it actually could be done. So something that went from this sort of vague idea and a fantasy about how I could do it, it was really powerful to see that somebody had done it. And then I thought, well, either I do nothing or I do something. I could just say she did it and that's it, or I should see if I could implement sort of my plan. That's too strong a word. It wasn't a plan. It was more like a fantasy at the time.
Okay.
So then in the fall of 2019, I started this class at Grub Street, and it was about 8 months. It was called the Memoir Generator, and it was all people who were thinking of writing memoirs. And I wasn't quite sure if my book was definitely a memoir or it was something else. And I would say even to this day, I'm not quite sure what category it fits in. But that was close enough that I could imagine I could write the sections about my own life. And so that's where I started doing that. And that went on for about till March of 2020, and the last couple classes were online. And
So you were doing the writing for this project specifically in that class?
In the class, right.
Okay.
And so it was maybe 8 other women we all would take turns reading sections to each other and commenting. And I think that was a really important class for me to take because I began to understand what it took to write a book, and that was different than what it takes to write a personal essay.
And what is the difference, do you think, or did you?
Well, I was just sort of starting at that point. Like, the interesting about the way the teacher taught it, that she taught a lot about taking your life and extracting the meaning. So to just write a story of your life, unless you're a celebrity, maybe even then if you are a celebrity, it's not particularly interesting. I mean, you could have bunches of anecdotes strung together, but I don't think a lot of people like to read books like that. And so this particular instructor was big on saying, well, what's the meaning behind it? You know, if you have an observation or a story about your life, what makes it meaningful about it? You know, how does it connect with other people, for example?
So coming up with some sort of cohesive theme?
Yeah,
or?
themes and just ideas about what does it all mean? So you tell a story, but so I have a lot of stories about, in this particular book, about one woman, one of the characters in the book, who's trying to figure out how to be an adult, basically. You know, how do you begin to feel yourself to be an adult? And so that was a theme that I could extract from a bunch of different stories that she told me about her life. Like, what does it mean to really be adult, to feel like you're grown up?
Yeah, and I think when you're saying, you know, you feel like you started thinking it was a memoir and then it sort of isn't quite a memoir, for me it almost, memoir feels so all-encompassing, from soup to nuts, versus your specific book is about marriage and divorce, and that's a very particular part of your life. So
Yes,
is
was
it
right.
that kind of distinguishes it for you?
No, I think all memoirs are segments of your life. That's the segments of your life that feel either most dramatic, most important to you, most transformative. And for me, it was a marriage that didn't work out and a divorce. And so, you know, part of that, a lot of these chapters take place within a few months of each other, and so it's not an extended period, although as I write it, it becomes more part of my life, but sort of the central activity that takes place is just in one summer into a fall maybe, or a year. And I've lived quite a long time, so that's not that much of my life.
At least 86 years since we've seen you.
So, and then I had to get, so that was the class, and then the pandemic came and everything shut down. But I was so lucky because I was in 2 different writing groups of the women who were in this class. And so here I am in a situation where there's really not much to do. You know, I was treating patients online, so I did that. But in terms of my social activity, I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't seeing anybody except these 2 groups I met every single week, probably for a couple of years. And I think sort of from a psychological perspective, it was a lifesaver. And from a writing perspective, it just moved me along in a way that I couldn't have done. Really, I couldn't have done it at all without these women.
Right. And how often were you guys meeting?
We were meeting every week.
Oh, wow.
Every
That's a
week
lot.
for maybe 2 years.
Wow.
And we were all writing and all reading each other's work. So that was a really wonderful experience to be able to do that.
And do you feel like you already had this idea, right? Before
I
you
had
had
the
that
idea,
group?
but to go from an idea to something that's really on the page and that's coherent, that's a pretty big leap. And it takes, I don't know, a gazillion drafts to get there. And so I did draft after draft. These are very patient women, but I was reading their stuff too, of the same chapter over and over until I got it into shape. I thought that kind of worked for me.
And when you're talking about this takes place during one summer, or
well, the triggering event starts in the spring,
Okay.
and then the actual divorce and sort of the fallout from that goes up until, maybe September. And then sporadically, I'm talking about other parts of my life, but sort of the central experience of the most difficult parts of my life would just take place over maybe 6 months.
Okay. So that's interesting from a writer's point of view in terms of trying to figure out where do you begin. I know that's a big
right. It is a big thing,
problem
right.
a lot of times. And thinking of maybe, like I think you're saying, sort of the most dramatic part of what you're trying to get across. And then did you do flashbacks to sort of fill in or bring the reader up to speed?
I did, and that's a whole nother challenge. I did some backstory, and it was very hard to figure out, have I put too much backstory in, or have I not put enough? Because I wanted to make it meaningful backstory I think is really tricky. It can slow down the story.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to make sure I didn't put in too many details about it, just enough so that the reader could understand how I ended up in the situation that I ended up in.
Right. And now this isn't a novel, right?
No, but
does it
reads
read like
it
one?
reads like a
Okay,
novel.
so it's nonfiction that reads like a novel. And so how do you do that? Because unfortunately, I don't know, nonfiction a lot of times can be dry or what did you find you were?
I think that's a good question. I like books that read like novels that are nonfiction.
Yeah.
So, Michael Lewis is one of those writers. I'm not a writer like he is, but I just love those books. It was sort of details that I had to put in, sort of sensory details, the way the novelist puts them in. Mm-hmm. I had to think about the characters, who they're going to be at the beginning of the story and who are they going to be at the end of the story, because they need to change, otherwise it's not a story.
Right.
So those were all important things. And I think the other thing, and that came later. So there were the 2 years of meeting with the writing group, and then I couldn't figure out how to structure it. I had all these chapters, but how do you make chapters into a story? And I had never done that before. And I found a developmental editor who I adore, and she showed me how to structure it so that I could have 3 narrative arcs, because there are 3 main characters. There's me, and there are 2 of my psychotherapy patients, one whose husband was unfaithful and had to decide whether she was going to stay with him or not, and another one who really just didn't love her husband. They had grown apart, and it was just a really dry marriage at that point. So people are, the characters are struggling with different things, but so here are these 3 arcs, 3 stories that have to, A, go somewhere, and B, follow something that connects them to each other.
And how were did you just treat them as three separate stories, or is there like, we're meeting for coffee every week? How do you bring them all three together, or is it
I
three
think I did it
parts?
by what the topics were that they were talking about. And so there's this triggering event. Everybody has something, that starts the story off. And that's the initial chapter for each of us. And when I wrote their story, they could tell me the backstory, right? Because I'm their therapist, and so they're
Right.
often telling me about how they grew up, why they ended up. So I got all that stuff from them. But with me, I had to figure out, well, which part of my life is the backstory that counts. So there's a triggering event, and then there's sort of like how they got to where they are, and then there's this whole, for two of them, like a decision to make. How do you decide to divorce? For me, it was more, I didn't make a decision, but how do you recover from a divorce? And so there's sort of like, I think, a similar arc for all of them. And then, everybody makes the decision, and then we talk about the story is, well, how do you come back from what feels like the worst thing that's ever happened to you, maybe?
Right.
And that's a whole nother part of the story. So the other thing that makes this not like a traditional memoir is that I speak in several voices. I'm talking about myself, my observations about myself, but I'm writing that as a psychotherapist who has worked with people for years. And so that in some way gives me a leg up. I sort of understand how to write it so that it makes sense to people. And then with the patients, there's my telling their story, but then there's my narrating, what am I thinking when I'm talking to these people?
Right.
And I think I like that part, and I think a lot of people like that part because people are very curious about what a therapist thinks about. Here you have somebody sitting across from you nodding, making some meaningful comment.
Hopefully not falling asleep.
Hopefully not falling asleep. But you really don't know what goes on in that person's head. And so I sort of extract that in the story. Here I am. For example, this one character whose husband was unfaithful. I show myself thinking, and she's still struggling if she should get divorced or not. I'm thinking to myself, get rid of this guy.
Right.
He's really bad news. It's nothing I could ever say, I'd ever think to say.
Right.
But that is a thought that pops into my head. Like, why are you agonizing about this after
Right.
so many bad things have happened to you?
Yeah.
So
I mean, I have to ask, like, do you have, I'm guessing you got permission from these
I did.
people.
Yes.
And how is that? Like, how, especially for memoir, I feel like is so tricky because it's not, you're the product of your environment and
Right.
the people around you, and you're writing, you can't just write about yourself in a silo. So
No, you can't, right.
how do you go about even starting to approach people to say, hey, can I include you in this book? And kind of maybe go into how did that evolve to like being able to reveal so much of even your thoughts when you're...
Well, the two patients, I asked permission, but I was pretty far into the story because I didn't really know it was going to go anywhere, so I wasn't going to bring it up. But I was pretty far into the story by the time I said, is it okay if I use your story? And I have done this with people in the past. People love it. Actually, patients
Really?
love it. Yeah, they just feel like I'm like representing them, and
Right.
and in the end they both felt that I had represented them accurately.
Oh, good.
So that was good. I didn't ask permission of anything else. I have an ex-husband I haven't seen since he left me, so he wasn't somebody I was going to inquire
Right.
of. But,
And you weren't worried he'd say, hey,
Well,
don't put
I-
bad stuff about me in the book or
he's
whatever.
never got in touch with me, so I had no sense he'd ever find out.
Okay.
And my parents were both gone, unfortunately, and I talked about them. The people I did not ask composites of, they're sort of minor characters, and there were composites of different patients that I have treated. And so there was nobody really to ask of, and I really worked hard at disguising what they had told me so they wouldn't be able to recognize themselves.
Okay, and so did the two people that you really do represent in here, did they get to read it before it was published?
They got the copy
They just
in the mail.
trusted you completely.
Yeah. And
That's
they got
great.
the copy in the mail after it came out, and they were both delighted.
Oh, wow.
And that really warmed my heart.
Right.
Because I wanted them to see themselves as I saw them, and it felt accurate to them, I
Right.
felt like I had really done justice to their story.
And were you nervous
Oh,
before?
I
I mean,
was.
I feel like I would be so stressed out wondering if
Well,
if
there
it's
was
gonna
one
go,
in
go.
particular because a woman who's has a husband who's unfaithful is a very sympathetic character. Who can't identify with that? But
Right.
the woman who had a small child and decided she did not love her husband anymore and needed to leave him is not, at least on the surface, as sympathetic.
Right.
I was sympathetic to her because I felt affection towards her. I could see the dilemma that she was in. I didn't want her to live a miserable life for the rest of her life. But that was a little tricky, and she was the one I was wondering if she would be okay with it. But she said she just thought I got the story right, and
Oh,
so
nice.
that really
Yeah.
felt good.
And I think that's part of the draw, honestly, for readers to a memoir is
Exactly.
wondering, am I the only one that thinks this way, or am I the only one that's ever
Right.
experienced this? And so, especially such a difficult subject, and to take 3 different scenarios
Yeah.
is what's the feedback you've gotten in terms
Oh,
of
wonderful. It's just so heartening. I asked a lot of people for reviews, and I felt like it resonated with them. They kind of were intrigued by the parts where I'm writing in the therapist's voice. Yeah, so I sort of thought, when you publish a book and you don't really know the outcome, I'm always sort of struggling with what am I looking for here? I wanted to write something, but what in terms of the public reception was I thinking about? And that's like a moving target. It keeps changing. But one thing I knew that I wanted to do is I wanted somebody to say, oh, that really means something to me. Like you
Right.
captured something that I could identify with. And I would say every single person who read the book said that about it. Whether you're divorced or not divorced, whether
I was
you're
just
married.
gonna ask
Yeah, you don't
that.
have to be because everybody's been in a relationship. Most people have had relationships ended. Everybody's been grief-stricken and for the most part, recovered from grief. And those are just the themes are so common that you don't actually have to have a divorce experience to be able to say, oh, this is what the story was, and I really identify with that story.
Right. And so that makes me want to ask the title.
Yeah.
So did you, when you're thinking, it's very specific, right? And obviously it sounds like your goal was to sort of help people beyond just being their therapist,
Yes,
right?
right.
In a written way. But did you feel ambiguous about that in terms of, is that going to hold me back? That, like
Well,
you're
I
saying,
have
only
thought
people
about
that
that
are
since.
divorced are going to think this
Yeah.
is the book for them?
Yeah,
Not
and I
just
think
grief.
maybe that is a problem in a way. It's just I like that subtitle so much that once I got it, I couldn't give it up. And
Right.
really, it is about marriage and divorce. So it's not misleading. It's just hard to communicate to people that this is a more universal experience than they might imagine.
Right. Yeah, because
So-
that's definitely, when you're thinking of titles,
Right.
it is, it's fun,
Yeah.
but also then there's just so many other things to be thinking about.
Right.
And I'm trying to picture how this book is laid out. Is it 3 complete separate stories, or are they all
They're
intertwined
intertwined,
in the chapters?
which made it even more challenging.
Okay.
More challenging and more interesting, I
Yeah.
think. Because you're sort of waiting to see what happens next to a character, but you've got to be patient because now you're going to meet the other character and try and see where she's going to go also.
Okay.
So, that's, I think, makes it intriguing.
Right.
To be able to sort of, and be able to bop around from story to story. And the end, the last chapter, is everybody's story. Like, where are
Okay.
they now kind of thing.
Okay. Wow, how ironic. That's nice. I mean, I think that's a nice way to end it, especially
It was good. Plus, it was in the pandemic, and the one woman whose husband was unfaithful to her came back to me. Many people came back to me during the pandemic. People I hadn't seen for decades were now wanting therapy. And she was just one of those people that came back, and I was really lucky to be able to get like the last chapter of her story so I could include it.
Right. So I just want to find out from you, how do you're treating people. So first of all, explain, just because I don't know that I totally understand, and I'm guessing viewers may not. What's the difference, like a psychotherapist versus a therapist versus a psychologist? or a psychologist? What's the difference
There's
there?
not very much difference at all.
Okay.
Everybody does the same thing. The big difference is between a psychiatrist who could prescribe medicine and everybody
Okay.
else. So there are lots of different degrees. There's lots of different names of what you're doing, but basically it's all the same thing. I think, the other thing that might distinguish people is some people treat patients from a particular school of thought. I don't do that, but some people will identify themselves like cognitive behavioral therapists, and that's just what they do. But I had a more eclectic approach, which is not unusual. I think a lot of people identify themselves in that way.
Right. And so when we're thinking of how this book is sort of treating people you can't reach or that maybe can't afford to go to
Yeah.
a psychologist or something, are there, once you've done this, are you thinking, there are other categories of outreach almost in book form that you'd want to do? Or now that you've done this, you've sort of been there, done that, and you have no
I
interest
feel like
in
I
doing
said what I wanted to say.
Okay.
I don't really have more stuff I want to say.
Right.
And so it's okay to stop there.
Right.
And to make this be a product that maybe will help people. I hope it does. So I feel
Okay.
like I've done it.
Yeah. And so walk through the difference between publishing an article, which
Yeah.
is a much smaller piece of work and almost instant gratification,
Yeah.
versus I'm guessing, a longer timeline,
Yeah.
definitely, and also the process of actually getting this book into book format.
Well, yeah, that was at least a year. First I went the traditional route. I looked for an agent. I looked for a small publisher. I queried people for about 6 months. I didn't really think it was going to work, but every step of the way I think to myself, well, I just have to do it and see what happens. Like, I can't skip over any steps because I'm going to regret it. I'm going to always wonder how did I sell myself short. So even though I didn't have a lot of hope, I did as best as I can. I did book proposals. I did the research on the agents.
And
tried
now
to look
that's
for-
something, book propose. So there is a
Oh.
difference between trying to get an agent, an editor for a fiction
That's
and
right.
a nonfiction. You want to kind of talk a little bit about that?
I don't know how you do it. I guess maybe you send them part of the book, but for a nonfiction, you need a book proposal.
Okay.
So, which is, doing the hook and describing what you did and what the audience is going to be. I had no idea that this was a thing that you do. And
Right.
It was hard. It was
Yes.
extensive to do that. And I was doing this thinking, this is a pretty big waste of time.
How did you figure out how to do it? Did
You go online. You look
Yeah.
at a million different ways to do it. And there's
Okay.
plenty of information about how to do it. It was not I didn't know how to do it. It's just like, how do you write it? I could
Right.
see how you structure a book proposal, but what about the content? Which of all the things I wrote about should I put into the book proposal?
Right.
But I figured it out. I did it as best I could. And then I thought, well, I didn't get anywhere. Maybe I should just give up. I mean, there was that thought that this was, I tried it. It didn't. And then I just couldn't stop. I don't know what it was. But there's something about seeing this to the bitter end that kept motivating me. And so I started to look into how to self-publish it. And then I found a company that I liked.
And what'd you go through?
They were called Author Imprints. They were recommended several places, and I really liked the guy, and I got some, recommendations. I talked to some of the clients he worked with and
Is
got
it
some.
local or based out of a certain area?
Oh, yeah, he's in California, but
Okay.
it didn't really matter where he was. We did
Right.
everything online.
Okay.
I thought he did a great job. They were very supportive. It was a totally different experience than querying people who never get back to you.
Right.
And I just really liked the way it came out. I liked the cover. That was really great.
Yeah,
I
love
just
that.
they helped me with the setup for the ebook and for the paperback book. They did a really, really nice job.
So like the formatting and everything
Yeah.
they helped you with?
And
Okay.
so I know people could do it themselves. I don't have technical skills to do it, and I thought I'd go insane if I had to do something like
Right.
that. So this was not cheap, but it was the only way it was ever going to get out there. And
Right.
I'm glad I'm happy at how it turned out.
Yeah. And so do they just send you a copy, or is it just online first and you have to wait longer? Or?
I think they were a little impatient with me. I went back and forth with them many times because the person who did the developmental editing also did the copy editing, so that had to happen
And you
even
want
before.
to explain the difference between
Okay.
developmental
So I was gonna
and...
show
Oh,
this
good.
for
You got
people.
show and tell stuff.
This is a 16-page editorial report. This is what I got after the first draft.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it's really, really detailed.
And I'm guessing they charge for that.
Yeah, they charge.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if the author imprints would have done it, but the person I used
Okay.
certainly
So that
charged
was
me for it.
separate. Okay.
But she was a delight, and she was another person I couldn't have done it about. So that happened, even before I sent it off for self-publishing. And when you get to the self-publishing, so then I had her to do the copy editing, which is the sentences and the punctuation and that kind of stuff.
And how did you find her?
I found her in a very weird way. I had taken a class, an online class, and there was an Australian author as part of this class. And I asked her who to go to. And she said, oh, this is an Australian person. She does it. She's a great editor.
Oh, wow.
And so
What's
I
her
did.
name? Do you want to
Yeah,
share?
Laurel Cohen. I don't know if you
Okay.
can
And
see
she's
that.
from Australia?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was also much cheaper than I could have ever done in the United States.
Right.
So she did the copy editing. And then after the copy editing, it has to be proofread. So she sent it to a proofreader in her organization who sent it back to me. And then I kind of went back and forth to the publisher. And each time I did it, I realized, oh no, I've used this word too many times. I forgot to do this. So I must have done, I don't know, another 50 versions with it,
Wow.
trying to fix it up.
And that was just you proofreading it.
Yeah. I was proofreading it after the proofreader proofread.
Okay.
And I wasn't happy. It wasn't his fault, but I just wasn't happy so
Right.
I had to really, and I'm not a very detail-oriented person. And so this was actually a struggle to get myself to sit with this and keep doing it as many times as I did.
Yeah.
So I guess I was proud that I was able to get myself to do it.
And you had to do that under your own motivation, or was somebody saying, can
Oh,
you get
no.
that back to me?
It was me completely.
Okay,
I would
and
just
that's hard,
realize it.
right?
Yeah, it was hard, but I didn't want to send it out and then say, "Oh no, I remember I shouldn't have used but so many times."
Right. And so did you do, I know I've done like find and just
this,
see
find
how
and
many, like
replace.
1,000 of
Right.
that word. And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I used too many rhetorical questions, and I had to just take them out and rewrite them over and over.
Wow.
So, this was the love of my life in a way.
Yeah.
It was my project. I wanted it to be as good as it possibly could be.
Right. And so you got it edited. And then what's developmental editor?
The
Would you
developmental
describe?
edit is way before that. It's when
Okay.
you have a draft, but for me it was I couldn't figure out how to structure it. I couldn't figure out what chapter should go after what part of the story should go after that. And so that was maybe after the first draft, I sent it to her. So that was even before I got this
And
publisher.
is this her?
This is her.
Okay. She
but
did
this
the
is-
developmental and the copy editing?
Somebody at her office did the
Oh,
copy
okay.
edit, but then she did a second,
Oh, wow.
which was a year after the first, where I sent her the second draft. Not quite as extensive, but also very detailed. And, for people that are trying to really write, I don't think you could do it without somebody to sit down with you and fix it all up like that.
Right. And this is beyond your critique group. Had your
Oh,
critique
way
group
beyond.
already done their editing
Yes,
and
they
feedback?
could do
Okay.
like the individual chapters, but
Right.
nobody could read the whole thing and say, do this.
Right.
But she knows how to do that.
Yeah.
And so I needed that.
And so this would be maybe akin to a beta reader, or did you also have beta readers?
I didn't have beta readers. I had
Okay.
my critique groups, and I have the editor. My husband, who writes too, maybe he was a beta reader.
Okay.
He heard a lot of the
Some casual
stories.
beta readers in there, and they read it from start to finish.
Well,
and
I
gave
read it
feedback.
to him twice
Out loud?
out loud.
Wow.
Because I found that I could only hear it if I read it aloud. If I
Yes.
read it to myself, I would be skipping over stuff. But when I read it to him, at one point, he was just sleeping. There was like a body there. And I just had to keep reading so I could hear it with somebody else in the room.
Right. So reading out loud is definitely wonderful. I've never heard of reading out loud to a person, which I think is it's sort of a double.
Oh, I think it's much better.
Yeah.
Because when
If you have
somebody's
somebody
sitting
who can
there,
take the time to listen,
Right.
yeah, or not sleep. So that's amazing. So he and you were both reading and editing it basically aloud.
yeah, really,
that's wonderful.
he could. Yeah, there's something about reading it to somebody else that you could really hear when you haven't written it the way you want to write it.
Right.
When it's awkward or you've repeated the same words too many times, that comes across very clearly when you're reading this aloud to somebody else.
Right.
So for any writer, I would say it's so labor intensive, but I can't think of a way around it.
Yeah. No, like I said, I've done it,
Yeah.
but just I couldn't find a willing soul to listen, which is too bad. But that's definitely something I hadn't ever heard, which I think is wonderful. So you got all your editing, and then they took care of the formatting. I'm guessing that you said they also designed the book cover?
Yeah, they helped me design it. My husband did some of it. They had some of it. We went back and forth. That was what was so good about these people, this author imprints. We went back and forth many times till I got it the way I wanted it. And I think, I don't know a lot about traditional publishers. I don't know if they have the time or the patience to just keep doing it till they do it the way they want to do it because they're going to be making the money.
Right.
Whereas this group is not going to make money off me, so it was okay to spend time getting it the way I wanted it.
Yeah. And so do you have to commit to buying a certain number of books, or is this just print on demand?
It's print on demand on Amazon and on Ingram.
Okay.
And there's an ebook on Amazon.
And what do you find people are buying the most in terms of the people that get it?
I don't know. I mean, early on, maybe it was more the paperback. Those are people I know. It's very inexpensive, both ebook and then the paperback book. So if you just want a quick read for a buck, you could get it.
Yeah.
On your Kindle.
And you can get it immediately online.
You can. It's amazing.
And increasingly people read that way. I'm not one of those people, but I like the physical book. So how long does it take for print on demand for if you purchased it and to receive it?
I don't know. I mean, it takes long for me because they don't care. They're not trying to please me anymore, Amazon. But for an actual customer, I think it probably says whatever it says. You'll receive this book. I know you don't do Amazon, but for most people it'll say you receive this book 3 days, something like that.
Okay, so not too long.
No, it isn't too long.
Okay.
They've got the whole thing set up perfectly.
Right. And so now you sit back, you have this book, and how do you feel about it? I mean, I know you're proud of it. You're happy with the people that were included or happy with it. And what's that process after you have
Well,
your
then
book?
there is so much to learn about marketing and self-promotion. And so I'm a real newbie. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't do Facebook. I didn't do LinkedIn. I didn't do Instagram. I avoided every single thing I could possibly avoid. And it turns out you can't market a book that way.
So what have you learned?
No,
since
I've
then?
learned how to post things on Facebook, how to join Facebook groups, how to get my LinkedIn profile all kind of spiffied up.
Okay.
So I met a woman who's just, as I was walking in my neighborhood, who does social media for authors. And she was kind enough to just sit down and show me how to do it.
Wow.
As a gift to me, basically.
That was lucky.
It was very lucky.
And so any lessons you'd want to share with people that are doing the same as you, like, I don't want to do that, but if I have to do something, would you say was probably more worth your while? Or if there were any that were like,
I
that
don't
was a waste of
know.
my
I mean,
time.
because I don't know how to compare it to other stuff. I mean, I would
Right.
never want to do Twitter. I don't want to be
Right.
tweeting stuff.
Xing, tweeting.
Right. I don't want to be doing any of that. So I don't really know. Like, I'm just doing it as best I can for a
Right.
little bit of money
Yeah.
to see how far I could go. And that's kind of my image.
Yeah.
I applied to book awards. That's not something I ever thought I would
okay.
do.
Good.
So that was an interesting experience also, because it looks like if you say you're an award-winning book author, you get further along.
And where did you find those? Any particular?
Googling.
You just had to Google
Oh, well, there is
individually?
actually I think it's called Alliance for Independent Authors, something like that. They have really good reviews of book awards, because it turns out they can be scams too.
Right. I mean, it is like when you say Google, it's like you can, but then
Right.
what do you
Right.
go with?
So I kind of, at first I thought this was a really ridiculous waste of money. I'm still not absolutely convinced it isn't.
Right.
But there's no harm. It wasn't an exorbitant.
Do you have to
amount.
pay for it?
Yeah, you have to pay
Okay.
for it. So you have to
Okay.
limit how many of these things you're going to do.
Okay.
And so some of these companies or organizations make money off people applying for book awards.
Wow.
So I didn't really want to get overly involved with that. But I found ones that I thought were reputable,
Okay.
hoping that whatever comes, maybe I'd get a little promotional stuff from them.
Right.
So I'm just flying by the seat of my pants.
It's a fun way to fly. Well, that's amazing, and I'm so happy for you,
Thank you very
and I'm
much.
very interested in reading this book. I have not read it yet, and I'm interested in seeing the three characters, and I also enjoy well-told nonfiction,
Right.
that sort of reads like a novel. So,
Yeah, I love that kind of book because you're so into the story, but you're also getting so much information that you never would have had otherwise.
right.
And so,
Like one that comes to mind that I don't know if your book is structured this similar way is Just Mercy
I don't
by
know that.
Brian. Gosh, I don't remember his last name now, but it's about the judicial system, which in a lot of
Oh,
ways
yeah.
couldn't be more boring.
Yeah.
But he just tells the stories
Oh, really?
at a human
Thank
level
you for the
that,
tip.
I'm thinking maybe your book is similar to that, that you're learning things, but also you're invested in the people that you're hearing about. So,
So one of the greatest compliments that I got was from my PCP, who wanted to read it when I told her about it.
oh, wow.
And she said, well, she's not a reader in the sense she doesn't read books, she reads stuff online, but she thought this book was addictive.
Really?
Yes.
So now she has to go to therapy with you.
She
to
just
get
couldn't
off
put
the
it down.
addiction.
And I thought, oh, that's really good.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's honestly, I think the best compliment you can get is
was.
if someone can't put the book down.
That's right.
So wonderful. Well, we'll end on that a wonderful note. With one last question, do you have anything that you've learned since the last time you were in here that you feel like is sort of a takeaway?
Oh, I learned how to write a book. I didn't know how to do that. I couldn't even imagine doing it. I guess I learned the lesson I keep learning over and over again. If you just keep at it, you could figure it out. Something that's completely foreign and overwhelming at first, if you just, walk through it with a kind of determination, it's surprising what you could do.
Wow, thanks, Ellen.
My pleasure.
Perseverance.
Perseverance.
Well, I'm so happy you came in.
Thank you very much.
And again, Bouncing Back, looking forward to it by Ellen Holtzman. And if anybody else would like to sit down and tell us about your book that you took from idea and all the way to published product, feel free to check The Room to Write at theroomtowrite.org and give us a ring. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you, Colleen. It's been a pleasure.